Thanks for tuning in, everyone, for another episode of Let's Talk. Today I have with me Sean Paul Murphy. Sean, how you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Good.
Living the dream.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you're here. Why don't you go ahead and tell everyone who you are and kind of your credentials and what it is you do?
Okay, my name is Sean Paul Murphy. I'm a writer, a screenwriter, a producer, an editor. I've written 14 produced feature films. I have a memoir published a couple years ago. I have a novel called Chapel Street coming out. I am a former 2012 winner of the $50,000 Kairos Prize for Screenwriting. A number of short films I wrote for the FBI true crime films that played on the Pentagon won a combined 6 Emmys. Though I didn't win one myself, the films won a bunch in different categories. So I can't say I'm Emmy Award winning, but the stuff I've written is.
Okay.
And other than that, I also I teach screenwriting at Towson University, and I work on reality shows for various Discovery Channel networks.
That's a long list of credentials. It sounds like you've definitely done a lot in your life. Uh,
Well, I'm old. Look at this hair; it's
no.
gray, and it's overly long because of the COVID.
No. Did you go to college for any of this?
Yes, I went to Towson University. Back then it was called Towson State. I started as a major in journalism, but one of my teachers brought in a bunch of his success stories. You know, students who had gone through the program, and we were supposed to interview them. And I was interviewing them, and I hate to say I wasn't impressed. One of them was a full-time journalist for a local newspaper, and he was making less than I was as a part-time busboy.
Mm.
You know, while I was going to college.
Mm.
So I eventually switched my major over to mass communications, concentration in film, but I also had a minor in English, concentration in writing. After that, I went into the advertising business, which was fantastic because working for an advertising agency is like working for a film studio. You know, you got your investors, the quote unquote clients, studio heads. You have to build a product. You know, you have writing, production, marketing schedule. I mean, it's, well, we were the marketers too, but it was like working for a studio that made a bunch of 30-second movies. It was a great experience. That's why I recommend my students who don't know what to do. I say, try to get into advertising. It'll get you a chance to look at all aspects of the business.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you went to Townsend University?
Towson,
Towson.
outside of Baltimore, Maryland.
And where were you born? Were you originally from?
I'm from Baltimore, Maryland.
Okay.
I've always lived within a mile or two of where I am right now. I
Even
haven't always lived here, but I've always lived within a mile or two.
even whenever you were doing the films?
Yes. Most of my films were shot out in California, probably 11 of them. But I would occasionally go out to visit just, to get some photos with the stars. But, but other than that, I stayed here. But I've worked a lot in New York. I used to essentially, for like 2 or 3 years, essentially worked all week in New York, came home for the weekends,
Okay.
my laundry, and to check my mail, and then went back to New York for the week.
Did you like New York?
I love New York. I don't know. I sort of left after 9/11. A lot of because I mainly worked in advertising up there, and a lot of the work dried up after 9/11, and it just the thrill was gone. And New York is a great place to live if you get a chance, but you really have to live, especially in Manhattan. You got to have money because you definitely want to take advantage of all the restaurants and entertainment and all,
Sure.
and rents are so unbelievably high. I have a house here, and I pay less for it than some people would pay for a shoebox apartment.
And
You know,
here is Baltimore, Maryland.
yeah,
Yeah.
here is Baltimore, Maryland.
Were you in the city when 9/11 happened? Were you there?
No,
No, you weren't.
no, I was not up there that
Okay.
week
That's
or subsequent weeks.
okay.
You
Yeah,
know, because
and you mentioned restaurants in New York. Where are some places that stand out to you? Are they still around?
I haven't been up there in a while, but I used to stay a lot at the Gramercy Park Hotel, and there were a number of places around there that I enjoyed. And a friend of mine had a friend who owned a number of restaurants like Steak Frites and a couple other places, and we would go to those restaurants.
Okay.
So it was just, and most of the time it was completely free to me because it was on the people's expense reports and
Hey.
expense accounts. And I was sort of like, they were my clients. So once I decided we were at some restaurant in Greenwich Village. We had the production company people, the director from the production company, and the creatives and some account executives. And we were at this one restaurant, and I said, "Look, please let me pay this bill because you guys are always paying." And they're like, "Well, if you insist, because I was just going, they were really going to be paying anyway, because I was going to be billing them." So the check comes. I said, "I'll take care of this." It was like $950, and I
Ooh.
give them my credit card, and they're like, "We don't accept credit cards."
Ooh.
And I'm like,
Ooh.
"Guys, you mind if I do the next one?" Because
Yeah.
I said $950 in cash on me at that time.
So, some of your films were filmed out in Hollywood, but you still lived around here, right? So that did that
Yeah.
make logistics difficult? Were you producing then at the same
Um,
time?
when I was producing the films, oftentimes I wouldn't just say that it was just a free title, because we would be consulted on casting and things like that. We get to put our 2 cents in. Sometimes they'd call and ask advice, but now I used to do that kind of producing, and even back when I was at advertising, I decided I didn't want to be that kind of producer. The kind of producer that has to be there to make sure the Winnebago's somewhere at 6 a.m. I never want to do that kind of producing again. I've done it. I don't want to do it. To me, the ideal producer for a movie, for someone who's a writer, was Patty Chayefsky, who wrote like Network and The Hospital, Altered States, though he didn't put his name on it. He got basically he was a powerful writer. I think he's the only screenwriter who's won 3 Oscars on solo credit scripts. A couple people have won 3 Oscars, but not on solo credits. And his idea of producing, and the best way of doing it, was he would be the producer. He would pick the directors. He would pick the actors. And once he got a director and actors he liked, he just got out of the way. And sort of that's my ideal, you know. And as generally speaking, the writers are very unwelcome on sets. You
Really?
know, yeah, because once the set's there, the director's the
Okay.
boss. Oftentimes, directors are very insecure and don't like having the writers there because it's someone else. People can appeal to. And case in point, like the first faith-based film I did. Oh, I just happen to have movies here. Was this one called Hidden Secrets, and it's the first one I did in California. And we went out to the set, and my co-writer, Tim Radishak, I should always mention Tim, I was like, whatever we do, just be quiet, just hang out at the craft service tables. But the lead actress comes up to us like day one, we're out there, and we're only out there for a visit, and says, now this scene where he's dancing with the girl, they're having this conversation. Do you think they should be standing up or sitting? I really feel they'd be doing it. I said, oh yeah, because of course I'm immediately swayed by the actress. I'm like, yeah, I agree with you completely. That's exactly how we intended it to be. And at that point, she immediately turns and starts running over to the director. The writer agrees with me on
Oh
this. You
no.
know? So that's exactly why they don't like to have the writers on the set. And it's funny because I was warning Tim about that, and here I am. It's like my first conversation with the lead actress, and I make the very mistake that I was afraid of.
Now, before you go to set, because obviously when it's set time, it's time to record, it's time to run through everything, it's time to get to business. When you're behind the scenes before all that, is there a lot of conflict between the departments, or does kind of everyone respect each other?
Well, the thing about the movie business is it isn't what everyone thinks it is. You go to college and all, and they say the director's in charge, and it's director's the auteur. It's called the auteur theory, which is really not true at all. Essentially, each movie's different because it depends how the money comes. Because ultimately, the money has the final say on everything. And I did a lot of films with a company called Pure Flix, and at least in the beginning, they called all the shots. I mean, even on this first movie, Hidden Secrets, I mean, the director, he shot the two closes. And then on one scene, the first scene I was watching him shoot, then he wanted to go for the wides. And the producer says, we don't have time for it. We're behind schedule. So the director didn't get what he wanted,
Mm.
you know, and that's often the case. And they wouldn't, and on one of my films, Sarah's Choice, the director was making all these script revisions. You know, he had like 10 revisions he wanted on the script, and we wanted about 7 of them ourselves. And we said to him, look, we agree with you on a lot of these things, but not going to happen. And I think the director was kind of mad at me about that, and because he wanted it his way, but it wasn't us that was stopping it. And I told him, and I had a very frank conversation with him. I said, "Look, here, I can tell you what's going to happen. They're going to push you off at post,
Mm,
And sure enough, that's exactly what they did.
mm.
They took the edit away from him and gave it to me. I mean, I didn't want the edit, but the in that case, they didn't. Pureflix didn't like the film. It was the film Sarah's Choice, and starring the gospel singer star Rebecca St. James,
Oh, really?
and yeah, and she was very sweet, and no one at Pureflix liked the movie. When we got it, I watched it with I called my co-writer over to my house so we could watch it on the big screen. They sent us a little file, but I made a DVD of it. So he and I sat down, and my wife we're going to take notes as they wanted our notes on it. And my wife said she had never heard me curse so much as
Mm.
watching it, because I had high hopes that it would be good, and I had like 5 pages of notes, typed up by the end, and I sent them to the producer, and the producer had already told me he didn't watch it all the way through,
Oh
and
my.
I think it had been sent to Rebecca St. James. She didn't watch it all the way through. The second lead actress didn't watch it all the way through, because it was just not good, and
Goodness.
but they were going to release it as is, because I can't remember who said it's a pro-life film starring Rebecca St. James. It's going to sell the same amount of copies, whether it's good or it's bad. But the film was important to Tim and I. This was like our third film, and we wanted it to be good. So I said, I said, can I re-edit it? Because I've been around enough. I could see that the performances were there. It's just that they were the director, and I wouldn't say they were sabotaging. They just had a theory about direction. And to me, as an editor, you can never, it's good to go into a film having a theory about how you're going to approach the material, but ultimately the material itself dictates the style of editing. And they were trying, because they felt that Rebecca St. James was a reactive character. She was like listening. She was being led one way or another by different people. A lot of times you would just see her during entire conversations, or practically entire
Mm.
conversations with other characters and on. It just wasn't always working. So I sent 5 pages of notes, and the producer he called me. He said, I sent him along to the he sent them along to the director, and he goes, but I rewrote them. I took all your snarky comments out of it. And apparently the director sent it to the editor. The editor cried, so,
Ooh.
but I offered, I said, look, let me re-edit the film. And they said, you can do it if you can do it in a week. So, I had a chance to re-edit the film in a week. I got paid less than I get paid a day for normal editing, but I was very happy because in the end, this was one of the better films that I've done. So I'm glad we did it, and it made an impact in people's lives. And so it was very well done. I think Tim's proud of it too, and I think Rebecca St. James is proud of it. We got to meet with her a couple times afterwards at various events and all. So it was a good time.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's really cool that you did a film with her. I mean, my wife and I, like, we grew up separately, obviously, but
Yeah,
like listening to Rebecca St. James, and now her brothers are for King and Country, really big
yeah,
band now, and that's really cool that you did a film with them. That's interesting.
yeah. She was very nice. She was the real deal. It's often scary to meet these people, but I liked her a lot. My wife got to come to the set on that one too. This case, we did Tim and I. Well, Tim didn't go; he was busy. But we didn't go to Hollywood. But the director was from Ohio, and my wife's from Ohio, so we decided to go to the set. And the funny thing was, I didn't bother. And the investors were also from Maryland, a friend of mine, and investor slash producer. And he couldn't make it either. He went out to the California shoot for part of it. So we're driving to Ohio, and my wife is driving, and I decided I'm going to open up to see what scenes they're actually going to be shooting on location. And I'm looking through them, and they're all red. It means they were all changed. And I noticed I was going to the shoot, and I hadn't written a word of what was they were shooting. And I'm like, oh, this isn't nice. So I get on the set, and the supervising producer was a Pureflix producer named partner named Russ Wolf. and who subsequently died of what's that, ALS?
ALS.
ALS. Very sad. But I get to the bar slash restaurant that's usually like our little headquarters, and Russ is sitting at a table. He's like pouring through the script, and he's like, Sean, we got to do something. I'm like, what? And he goes, well, look at all this stuff. I've never seen this. And I go, yeah, it's nothing I wrote. And he's like, well, we're going to have to do it. But the director came over and he explained that we were filming like a demonstration, and he wanted some pro-life activists to actually kind of say what they were doing. So essentially he had just written some notes for what they were to say. And he wanted real people to say real things. And of course, I'm all for that if it
Sure.
works. So it was fun. Actually, and the director and I, despite our, he had gotten us fired off a previous film called In the Blink of an Eye. Tim and I, and but Tim and I were not happy with the way the film was going, and we had a conference call with the director and two of the producers, and after the call, Tim called me up and said, "How do we get off this movie?" And I said, "We can't. We've already agreed to do it. It would be unprofessional." And the next day, we got a call from the producer firing us, and we couldn't have been happier. But this director was originally supposed to direct that movie. He ultimately didn't. But in the end, we ended up very well because I was always honest with him. I think I was probably the most honest person with him on the production. So, you never know how things are going to turn out.
Yeah,
I prefer to have really good if at all possible, relations with the director. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm sure you have stories for days, and we could talk about your directing all the day.
Very scary stories.
Well, let's dive into your book real quick, because not real quick. I mean, let's talk about it. Because
okay, good.
Yeah, we are here to
watch out. I have 14 seconds to talk about the book. Hey, look, there's the poster of the cover of the book on another computer right behind me.
Right there.
Oh, it's right there too. Good.
All right, everyone. This book is called Chapel Street. Why don't you tell everyone what this is about? Because it's very interesting.
Okay, it's a paranormal thriller. It's about a guy, Rick Backos, who finds himself straddling the line between sanity and insanity while battling a demonic curse that has driven members of his family to suicide for generations. So he, of course, doesn't realize that at first, but there's a huge string of suicides in his family going back for a very long time, including more recently his brother Lenny and his mother. And after he takes he's unable to figure out what's this curse in his family. And when I say curse, I don't mean literal curse at this point in the book. He's wondering why his family members are killing themselves. So he got into genealogy, and he became a volunteer for a web page called it's based on a webpage called findagrave.com, where they're trying to get every grave recorded in the world. I call it restingplace.com in the novel. In fact, that was the original name of the book, but I couldn't use it because every time there were programs, anytime I typed the name, it would come up as a hypertext. There wasn't a webpage, and I didn't want to buy it and set material up there. So I changed the name of the book to Chapel Street. But the thing about this book is that it was inspired by a true haunting that my family experienced. I grew up in a haunted house starting in about 1974. I was like 13 years old. We moved to a haunted house in the Laurelville section of Baltimore. And it was a very intense experience. I'm writing a series of blogs about it on my webpage, SeanPaulMurphyville.blogspot.com.
I'll throw a link. I'll throw a link to your blog and all your social medias in the description. So guys, check it out below.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, check it out. But eventually, in this haunting, two of my siblings killed themselves. My brother Mark killed himself in 1999, and my sister Laura killed herself in 1994. And a number of other people in my family either consciously attempted suicide after we moved into this house, or experienced things which I call suicide events, which were supernaturally inspired events that, had they gone to their logical conclusion, would have been misconstrued as suicide. So in a sense, we were lucky we only lost two. And this book, the origins of this book was about 2 years ago, maybe 2.5. My mother pulled me aside and asked me whether I thought that the entity in the house was responsible in part for the deaths of my two siblings. So this book gave me a chance. It's very exaggerated. I mean, the book is extremely exaggerated, but it gave me a chance to explore that possibility in fictional form. And after my family members started to read my book in the rough draft because I wanted to share it with them
Hmm.
because it was inspired by real stuff. My sister looked at it and she said the book was essentially a cartoon version of the real events.
Mm.
So my sister decided to have a family meeting to discuss what happened at the house at 21 St. Helens Avenue. And because we never discussed it because we felt that that the entity would follow, it could follow, which if you study these paranormal events would indicate that it's demonic, like a ghost entity will stay where it is. And two, we always felt that talking about it empowered it. So we didn't talk about it, and also three, we didn't talk about it because we didn't want people to think we were crazy. So, but
Sure.
there were a lot of events, and my sister called a meeting to finally say, let's talk about what happened at the house. And as a result, I started interviewing people to do a very long oral history, examining the events at the house, but not only with family members, but with other people too, and the house before we got there, and the house after we left. And I'm in the process of that. It's really a three-pronged thing. First, I'm dealing with the haunting. Then I'm going to do a series of blogs about my siblings' deaths. And then I'm hoping to do it in the end, a recap with expert opinion. I'm hoping to get like an evangelical Christian viewpoint, a Catholic viewpoint, and a strictly secular
That'd
viewpoint.
be interesting.
And then I'm going to hopefully have something that would be a best case document on how to respond to these circumstances. Because I can tell you one thing: our family didn't respond to it well. Somebody asked me, "Hey, you should write a book about this." I go, "This is not a good book because we just walk away."
Yeah. So so
We lost. We lost. That's not a happy ending. That's not the book I wrote
right.
or the movie.
So
So
so up until this point, up until your sister calls the meeting, you guys all had different experiences and you just never talked about it at all. Even growing up, you never talked about it?
well, I was like 13 when we got there. Nothing happened to me in that house for 10 years,
10
but
years.
yeah, for 10 years. What I like to say is that this wasn't one haunting, it was seven different hauntings
Okay.
ultimately, because it, people had different, it treated people differently. And I'm trying to figure that out why. But essentially, there's some people in my family I think are more spiritually attuned to that sort of thing. It seems to be traveling down my mother's line. How they like say
Hmm.
psychic powers or psychic awareness, and even just saying the word psychic makes me kind of shaky. It's like I don't even know what that means. But there's definitely the case that it seemed to interact more strongly with females in a number of different ways, and there was an there. This was a it was hardly noticeable to everybody until about 10 years in, when my mother and a friend of hers brought a Ouija board to try to communicate with a friend of my mother's friend's aunt who had died. And they went to this room in the attic called, which was a bedroom. It was currently empty at the time. And we call it the hell room now. And the rest of the time we lived there because, they had a very bad experience with the Ouija board there. And after that, it sort of opened something else up. And after that, it was like really high grade stuff. It was like Poltergeist and The Exorcist thrown together in that house.
Wow.
After that point, it pretty much affected everybody. My older brother who left the house before that time, will say nothing. There was never anything at the house. If I'd have left that house in 1984 or something, or 1985, they would tell me it was haunted. Or if they would have told me their experiences they had there, I simply would not have believed them. I would have said, I've been there for 10 years and nothing's happened. I don't believe this. Because I'm really kind of a skeptical person. I really only believe haunt this one because I experienced it. And it's really, even now as I'm trying to research it and trying to get other opinions, it's really a slippery slope because I'm trying to put away any preconceived prejudices I have, theological or otherwise. about this haunting in order to and just go where the evidence falls. And but it's still it's a slippery slope because I just don't believe everything that everyone is saying out there. I
Sure.
don't believe all these paranormal investigators. I don't know if their equipment, maybe it's registering something, but I don't know if it's registering what they think it's registering or it's being caused by what they think it's being caused. But I know what happened to me personally. And I believe my siblings, because some of it happened around the time I was there to experience it. And there was a very brief period where we did talk about it and before we stopped. It's right after the Ouija board. My sister was abroad when she came home with her husband. There were some very intense experiences and we discussed it. But once she moved out, we just never discussed it again. And we never talked to the younger members of the family about it.
And so you guys get together. I guess you talk about it for a brief time. Are there any common threads, common stories that kind of came up among multiple siblings and family members?
It's actually, there was more common stuff than I thought. But there are certain things I'm trying to examine this haunting the way that like an ichthyologist would examine a new species of fish or
Hmm.
something. That's right, ichthyology fish, isn't it? I think so.
I have no
But
idea.
you know, when we did talk about, some people thought there was more than one thing. Just because of my theological background, I believed it was just one entity that was masquerading and giving itself different things. But there were really two center, but I believe that there were two hauntings in the house. There were at least two entities. There was definitely one when we got there. Day one, my late sister saw something day one. So it was always there. It was there before we were there. And that entity, I believe, lived on the second floor of the house. There was a combination of three bedrooms, separated the master bedroom, one closet. Sorry, it was closets. I mean, one closet for the master bedroom was adjacent to a closet to the second floor bathroom, and there was a third closet joined in there. That were three closets, and the haunting seemed to be centered in there. And those closets are interesting. That those closets were not originally a closet. If you look at the room, because it has an outdoor window that has a wall down the center of it, that was originally a room, and we don't know what the purpose of that room was
Hmm.
and why that room would have that centering. But as I did people's interview, that entity that was on that floor predominantly was sort of like a shadow figure, which if you study this, you'll hear quite a bit about, like a cloaked figure. It was tall. It would sometimes appear as a black blob. Sometimes, it'd be in a dark room and you'd see an extremely dark area, like much darker than it. Sometimes it was a blob, but sometimes that blob would form into a shape of a cloaked figure. I asked them whether it was male or female. They would always instinctively say male, but then when they thought about it, they would say, "Well, it really didn't have." They don't think it had
Hmm.
a gender. They would just think it was male because it was aggressive, because it was large, and it had a real aggressive vibe to it. So they just would naturally think it. Sometimes this entity would have red eyes, particularly if you saw it in the closet itself. Sometimes it would have more of a human face, not always. The entity on the second floor, I mean the third floor. Now there are two bedrooms on the third floor. I lived in the rear back bedroom, and the front bedroom was the one where they did the Ouija board, which we would later call the hell room. That entity was probably 10 times more aggressive than the one on the
Hmm.
second floor. The one on the second floor was aggressive, don't get me wrong, but this one was much more aggressive, and it would appear in a cat-like shape, but not like a kitty cat, but like a leopard, a very angry, vicious leopard. It also, if you saw it it seemed, even in the hell room, lived in a. There were two closets, one that went, a low one like a cubby hole that went under the eaves of the house, and on the other side there was a stand-up closet that you could like hang clothes in, and that one seemed to live in the stand-up closet. And if you would see it in there, it would sometimes have red eyes, like the one downstairs. But essentially, from behavior, it seemed like there were two different entities in the house, at least two. And I wouldn't have believed that. I would not have subscribed to that theory until I started doing these interviews.
Is there anything in particular that tipped you over to start thinking that there were two, like in conversations? Because you said you
Well,
were
it was
skeptical at
just
first.
as I recorded these interviews, the behavior of the things on the second floor and the thing on the second floor, the thing on the third floor was different.
Okay.
People were experiencing it differently. Um, the one on the one on the second floor would get into bed with people, or at least sit on the bed with them.
Mm.
It would also sometimes like, do you say sexually molest someone? It would fondle them, or it would get in
Goodness.
bed and spoon with them.
Whoa.
And that was normal for it.
Whoa.
And that also seemed to be the one that would follow. Like if it would be like we'd be at someone's house and they'd say, "Tell us about what happens at the house," and we wouldn't do it because you know, because it could follow us.
Wow.
I believe we've had incidents here since subsequent to this writing of these blogs about it. I think
Really?
I'm the only one had any following since then. I really don't want to get into that now, but
No, it's okay. You don't have to. So I mean, obviously you're a Christian.
yeah.
You have faith. Uh, not necessarily the book. I don't want any spoilers for what happens in the book. But you personally, whenever you were writing this book, was there a struggle within your faith of everything that happened? Was it challenging at all for you?
Well, my faith, it's interesting. What I believe, and what comes out, I believe in the book, is that American Christianity has a very shallow opinion of, a very shallow interpretation of demon warfare and all. It's like when I was first hanging out in some really evangelical circles, because I was raised Catholic, people would go, "Oh, I'm going to the deliverance ministry," and it'd be like, "Oh, the spirit, the demon of smoking was cast out of me, the demon of lust, and this."
Yep.
And
I've
I'm
been
like,
in I've been
"Really,
in
there's
those
a
circles.
demon of smoking?
Yeah.
What did it do for the thousands of years before smoking even existed?" And it was sort of like the kind of thing that, like, poof, and it's magically gone. But if you look at the Bible, it's a lot more complicated. There were demons that the disciples couldn't throw out, while Jesus was walking with them, and I prayed on it. I had a very active life. I wrote a book called The Promise, or the Pros and
Yeah.
Cons of Talking
I've
to
got a
God.
picture of that. I can throw it up for people.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Well,
you
I
do
have
too.
one too. Look at this. Look at this. People bought it despite the fact that it has a picture of me on the cover. So, but in that I relate my born again experience and how the Lord would often answer prayers and give me things like words of knowledge. But when it came to dealing with this entity in the house, it took a great deal of prayer to cast it just out of my bedroom.
Wow.
A long time. And at one point I prayed to the Lord, "Why don't you cast it out of why can't I cast it out of the entire house?" And the Lord responded, "It's not yours to cast out." And at a later point, when something happened at the house, I'm like, Lord, why won't you just take this out of his house?" And the Lord responded to me as you said, "You don't want it gone. You want to write about it." And which I took that, as a chiding, but you know, that's why I really decided I wasn't going to write about it. But now I feel I must write about it. And the novel Chapel Street was like sort of my first attempt to try to say, what am I willing to say? Am I really willing to write about this? So I went at it fictionally first in this book, Chapel Street, and it is very exaggerated, but there's a lot of truth in there, a lot of stuff that happened, a lot of what the attitude is, both to deal with a demonic force, that's set to destroy you. And also it deals a lot, the book deals a lot with the relationship between the lead character, Rick, and his brother, Lenny, who killed himself.
Mm.
And I drew a lot of that with the character Lenny from my brother, Mark, who ended up killing himself. And Mark, not often, but periodically would give me, talk to me about his challenges and, how difficult, how life under the pills, everyone's just says, take your medication, and why people get off their medication and things like that. And what it's like to be institutionalized, what it's like to come out of an institution, and have to rebuild your life over and over again. So,
And
and I
so,
do, and I do feel guilty about my brother because, I mean, he was dealing with a lot of issues.
yeah.
And while he was alive, I never contemplated that he might have been there might have been a spiritual aspect to his mental illness,
Right.
possibly the entity. But since I started putting these blogs up, his friends have been seeing my blogs on Facebook. A couple of them have told me very interesting things. Like one that one of them, when he briefly lived in the hell room. Well, I wouldn't say
Whoa.
briefly. He was up there for about 6 years or five,
Yeah, that's a
maybe
long
about
time.
a long time.
That's a
But
long time.
this was before it was really active. This was the one before the Ouija board.
Okay.
After he moved out, that's when my mother went to Ouija board up there because that room was open. Um, but he did say that when he was up there, he would hear voices. He would hear his mother and his grandmother talking about, forcibly institutionalizing him. Now, these things he did was not hearing real voices. It could have simply been mental illness, or it could have been the demon, because another thing that the demon did, and was that it would mimic voices. You would be at home and you would hear people that were not at home, people that were like on Maryland's Eastern Shore, away for vacation, talking to you, calling to you in
Whoa.
the house. You
Whoa.
know, so, so whatever the entity was had the ability to let out audible sound that mimicked the speech of people that were in the house. I never heard it. I never saw it at the house. I never visualized it, and I never heard it speak.
It, it,
It kind of communicated with me, but I never heard it do audible speech.
and so in your book, Chapel Street, um, there's more. We get some from Lenny. Was that the character's name, Lenny?
Yeah, Lenny.
We get from his perspective. We kind of get a little bit of what your brother was like, and kind of like how he saw the world. But
Yes, we definitely get how that character saw the world and saw the difficulties of living with mental illness and how people reacted to it. And it's also, there's a lot of guilt in the book because I don't know if you ever had anyone with like bipolar in your family or
I have
anything.
I know someone who is bipolar, but they're not family members. But I know someone with it.
It's very demanding, and it's emotionally draining. And before my brother, got ill, or we realized he was ill, I was like in some church groups where there would be bipolar people there, and they would all be sort of like been abandoned by their families. And I would always thought, what cruel, horrible families are for abandoning these sick people who need their help. But once you've been in those circumstances, you understand why they abandoned them. Recently, we have a friend who was dealing with these issues in the family and just finally, cut the strings with them, and it's like, I understand why, and I always tried to be helpful to my brother, but now that he's gone, I wonder, was I helpful enough?
Right.
And I also, as a Christian, have to look at it and say, did I miss a spiritual aspect to his mental illness? I'm not one of these guys. You'll see a lot of folks, men and women, who believe that mental illness is demonic, all of it. I don't believe that at all. But I do believe once you lose, mental illness can open the door to
Mm.
other things as well. But, you know, I know that there's been some Christian leaders who have gotten in trouble by telling people, get off your meds, you're healed. My advice to anyone, Christian, non-Christian, of anything, stay on your meds. Please stay on your meds. That's my advice.
Well, I'm absolutely just incredibly sorry, about everything you've gone through. Your siblings committing suicide. I have a grandmother who died, but it's a little different because we watched her
Yeah.
decay with Alzheimer's in the nursing home, and we knew it was a matter of time, so we kind of prepared ourselves for that. I had a friend whose brother killed himself, and that was really hard. Like, how do I deal with that? Because I knew his brother as well, and that's incredibly challenging, and I can't imagine what it's like
Well,
for
anytime
you.
there's suicide, there's always guilt.
Yeah.
Because you always say, like, everybody always wonders, what is there some, if I could have talked to him that day, if I could have talked to him
Right.
that week, and then there's always suspicion that, if you weren't there or if there was no note, was it suicide? Were they killed? Was this that? But the reality is, like my sister died, she didn't leave a note. You know, my brother died and he left a note. And my sister, in retrospect, we could have saw some warning signs when she died. But when she killed herself, it was a total out of the blue
Mm.
thing. I mean, it utterly crushed and devastated the family. My brother dying, on the other hand, that was a train going down the track. We didn't see much way that he could survive. Because he was cycling more and more into madness at times, and when he was crazier, he was becoming more violent. So, at times. So we had, it isn't like we could be as hands on, because we were scared. And, but he was a great guy. And even when he was crazy, even if he was on a rant or rage, it was because in his mind perception, he was helping someone,
Wow.
you know, but
Yeah.
in some ways he would help someone could be potentially destructive. So, but there, the entire families, friends, everyone wonders when someone kills themselves.
Yeah.
Why did they do it? What could I have done? And back to the notes, like, everyone wished there was a note for my sister because they would feel that it would explain why. But no, my brother left a note, but the note was so crazy you could see, well, he was crazy, but it still doesn't justify or explain, or it's like
Right.
you don't suddenly go, oh, okay, I read the note, I'm
Right.
at peace with it, so if my sister had left a note, I don't think we would be at any more peace with her death.
Yeah, and like a note obviously can't explain years of struggle. Like there's,
Exactly.
you know.
And also too, there's it's a sense, it's a giving up that, unless we were in there, we would say, if they were writing the note and they were sharing it with us while they were still alive, would say, that's no reason to do this, do
Right.
this and that,
Right.
you know. I had my own brushes with suicide and or death, and you know, it. I almost killed myself after a breakup with a girl once, but it was really more of a battle between me and God.
Mm.
And it was more of a struggle between my faith, and it's sort of like I wanted answers. If you don't do what I ask you to do, God, I'm going to come up and talk to you in person, type of situation. And but I was very cognizant of what I was doing. I wasn't like, it wasn't crazy. I knew I would die, but at that moment I felt, it was worth it. And I was also, I will say, and this is the most selfish thing, I was cognizant. I almost did this in the living room of the haunted house. And it was a Friday night, and I knew traditionally my little brother would be the first one up Saturday morning because he'd want to rush down and watch the cartoons. And even though I knew my brother would discover me, and he was probably 8 years, 6 or 8 years old at the time, it was like, it's like, I was still going to do it,
Mm.
even though I knew it would traumatize him, So, I mean, you're not in your right mind at that viewpoint. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
hard to,
There.
there's something, and I don't mean to like blame the victim, but I've looked at suicide from both sides as someone who's experienced the suicides and others and nearly committed it myself. So I view myself as an authority. And I'll say that, I knew my wife's laughing. I know, I was performing a selfish act. And I'm not saying every person knows that, but I knew that me dying was going to hurt people. And and they often say some people, and maybe they do, commit suicide in order to hurt somebody. But it was not my intention to hurt anybody when I died. But I knew if I would have succeeded. But I knew it would hurt people, but I felt the reason I was doing it would justify, at least in my own mind, the reason, the pain it would cause others.
So I went through a year ish of being really depressed. I got suicidal. Yeah, I remember nights where I was like, I'm just going to end this. I remember being there, and it's for me. I don't know if you experienced this, but whenever I was down there, depressed, lonely, I was almost numb to the world. I didn't care about anything. People would have conversations with me. I just didn't care what they were talking about. I had nothing. Is that similar to your experience?
Well, here's the thing, because I had a very active relationship with God. God was leading me in a certain way, and I veered off of it, and which resulted in a lot of problems in my life. I mean, I knew what I was supposed to do and chose not to do it. And so I ended up, kind of estranged. I was being held, in a sense, God was holding me accountable for
Mm,
my own actions.
mm,
But still, I mean, there was no reason to be like it does involve a woman to a degree, but when I was last time I saw her, I was driving home from where she went to college, and I was just overcome by this profound sense of depression. It was like a total mental, emotional, spiritual collapse. and and it's inexplicable because this is in my book, The Promise or the Pros and Cons of Talking with God. You know, this is one of the key incidents in the book the book builds to this, and I found myself in this circumstance. And at the time when I was writing the book, I was looking at the everything that was leading up to that because this was very vivid in my mind even then, so many years later. But it's like there was no explanation for this complete suddenness and the total
Hmm.
collapse,
Hmm.
my total, interior collapse. There was no explanation for it. That's why I'm including it now as I'm doing these blogs, because I'm wondering, considering how much suicide was in that house and these suicide incidents, I'm wondering if I was also my weakness that ended up allowing me to fall prey to this, to the oppressive spirit in the house as well. And I'm looking at, I've been really examining that in myself, and I can't discount that possibility. But I don't look at this as assured of that as it was for other circumstances in the house. But yeah, I was totally, I was, and after that time, it took me a long time to recover. I was really kind of bitter with God, and I would have died. I was prepared to do it. I was going to kill myself with a knife,
Ooh.
sitting in the like an armchair.
Ooh, brutal
And
way.
I demanded a miracle of God to save my life. I was pushing the knife in,
Oh my. Oh my
and
goodness, you were there.
I was there. I was pushing the knife
Oh my
in
gosh.
when the miracle came. So God could have waited couldn't have waited another second. Let's put it that way.
Do you talk more about that moment and everything that happened in the book? Because if so, I don't want to
Yeah.
give any spoilers. Okay, people
No,
get
no,
the
no.
book.
I mean, the spoiler is I lived.
Well, yeah, yeah, very much so.
I did survive, but it was a tremendous life experience, and I think the book is in many ways a suicide book, and I've given it to people who've experienced suicides in their family, and they felt that it helped them a lot, because I have my near suicide on chapter 15. Then I have a chapter, called the lost years, where it's sort of like I was just stumbling around. And I come out of it, and my sister commits suicide. So it's like in 3 chapters, I deal with like 2 suicides, an
Good.
attempt by myself, and then my sister's death. And, it gives a lot of insight. And I think, people have told me that the book was very helpful to them, looking at it that way, and although I say it's selfish to commit suicide, I think everyone realizes that you can't necessarily blame the people. I'm certainly not blaming the victims, because you find yourself, particularly if you're really dealing with serious mental illness, your mind works
Right.
in a certain way that does not allow you to pull out of this
Right.
thing. And I was at that thing, and I'm sorry to hear you were
Yeah,
in that stage too, but you obviously pulled out as well.
I did.
So
I did.
did you think this interview was going to go to
No,
this way?
no, I didn't. But I'm pretty open about it. Anyone who wants to talk about it. For me, it wasn't a girl that's triggered it. It was I started to think that God wasn't real.
Mm-hmm.
And for all you atheists out there watching, I'm sorry. This is just what happened to me.
Yeah.
I started thinking God wasn't real, and if that's the case, then there's no meaning to life. If there's no afterlife, there's no meaning to our decisions. Sure, we can help the people alive now and future generations, but ultimately, when society disappears, it doesn't matter. And so that just obviously just made me super depressed because like you can't justify anything. And so what turned me around, I don't even know what happened, what triggered it, but it was just like one day I was like, I gotta get serious about God, and then I started doing actual reading, actual research from intelligent figures of the past, like some of the early church fathers, and that really started to spark the interest. So what pulled me out of depression and suicide was diving head into deep theology.
Augustine.
Augustine, yep, Augustine, Ignatius of Antioch, yeah, the big names. That's kind of what I read now as far as theology goes. Is the early people.
Why would you read those people when you could be reading Kenneth Copeland instead?
Yeah,
You know,
it's
just
it's
kidding.
it's a tough decision. It's a
It's
tough.
so funny because like there's so many books out by all these like modern preachers. That's sort of like there's this great wisdom in the past,
in the
that
past.
people
Yes.
weren't even availing themselves of.
Yeah.
People who were students of the actual disciples.
Right.
People were like saying, well, this is how the early church went, based on some American trend. It's like,
Right.
we could actually just look at, the people who were there at the
Right.
time.
Yeah, you could just read the writings of Polycarp, who discipled under John, and just see what John taught him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really amazing. But you and I are almost exactly the same in our viewpoint. My book, The Promise or the Pros and Cons of Talking with God, was about, as I said, I had a very active relationship and God was telling me things. And in 1977, I was in a pool with a neighbor girl. I was in my grandmother's pool with a neighbor girl. And I never really thought of her as like a girl. She was just a neighborhood. I was closer to her brothers and all. And the Lord told me, He said, behold your wife. I'm like,
Ooh.
I was probably 16 or 17 at
Yeah.
the time, 16. And that was kind of a shocking revelation. The Lord had never told me to behold my wife before. So, of course, I couldn't figure out how to ever talk to her. And it was 2 years before we went on our first date. And she actually kind of asked me out. So I knew the Lord's hand was in it. If He was waiting for me to ask her out, He was going to need a
Yeah.
miracle. So we were together for a number of years. We were talking marriage. So it seemed like, wow, this is really happening. But then our relationship kind of fell apart one summer, and she went back to school, and we were kind of estranged. And the Lord was telling me, don't worry, don't worry about it. It's all going to work out. It's all going to work out. That holiday season, Christmas, my father had an aneurysm. Now her family and my family were close, so you know, my father being sick, it was something she cared about too, other than just because he was my father. And we were starting to get back together again, and in our best times, because she went away to college, was when we would go out to her dorm room. I would drive up to her college and all. It was a time that we could really be ourselves. And she invited me out to college. And this was like the huge return after the estrangement. We're getting closer and closer again, and now she's inviting me out. And she called me and invited me out, and I said, and then the Lord told me, He goes, you don't go. If you don't go, you'll have everything you want in 1 month. But if you disobey me and go, I will withdraw my hand from this relationship.
Ooh.
So being a good, faithful Christian, I went, because God had always forgiven every other one of my mistakes. So I assumed, it's like, 7 years ago, you told me, behold my wife.
Right.
This is what you want. You're not going to let my sin get in the way of you doing what you want. So I thought I had carte blanche to do whatever I want. But He did pull His hand off the relationship. That's driving home from that week. I will probably say that was probably the best weekend of my life that I had experienced up until the time I met my wife.
Yeah, just because I'm here.
I'm not just saying that just because you're here. But that was literally the best weekend of my life. So which made this emotional collapse that I had on the way home
Yeah.
all the more shocking. But the thing was, it came down to, I knew it was over. Even though we were still talking, even though,
Right.
things were still very warm, I knew it was over. And to me, it's like, I did not want to live in a world where God could do something like that,
Right.
And to me, it was like, I want, it's like, hey, you're lying to me. You said that she was going to be my wife. Now she's not going to be. How, to me, that cracked the universe in half.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be a part of a world where that could happen. So I demanded a sign from God. It was a little sign, but it was important. And just basically to show that even though this was gone, that He was still in charge and He still had plans for me. And if He wasn't going to give me that sign, I was going to go up and talk to Him about it. Not that I'd be able to do much with that knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that's a conversation you want to have. Yeah. So I know we went off on a little trail about our Christian viewpoint and the togetherness we share there. But for everyone at home listening, The Promise is about your struggle with God and through that whole time. But Chapel Street is not a Christian book. It's a paranormal thriller.
It is a paranormal thriller. And I wrote it, because I've written a number of Christian films. I mean, I
Right.
know the faith market and I know the other market. This is aimed at the mainstream audience, but you can't have a book about battling demons without some God in it.
Right.
I mean, so there are theological themes in it. There are Christian themes. There are theological themes in it. But it's a horror novel. The Christian audience will probably not embrace it because it's very, it's scary. It deals with sexual issues in there too. It isn't like there's a lot of graphic sex or graphic language, but it deals with the kind of stuff and violence. It deals with issues that the Christian market prefers not to have in there. If you go to most Christian movie review sites or book sites, the main way they judge stuff is to say there are 3 curse words in it. There's smoking,
Mm-hmm.
there's drinking, there's drugs, there's drug use. And, so they have like a checklist of things which makes
Right.
a book either good or bad. If someone's drinking in it, there are people, oh, there's drinking in that book. I'm not going to read that book, because I don't want to be exposed to that, So,
Yeah.
as if there is, that's one of the frustrations about working in the Christian film business is that, and I say this all the time, and I really believe it's true. The films, what I discovered is that the films were being marketed. Everybody says they want to make films to reach people for the Lord, but you're really not reaching people for the Lord. You're just
Right.
entertaining the Christian
Right.
audience. Because my thing I always say is, if the world we present in the films, it doesn't seem real, then our solution isn't going to seem real either.
Right.
If Christian films, even the worst sinners are like 90% Christian, 95% Christian
Right.
anyway.
Right.
All they have to do is say, okay, Jesus, I'm all yours. But they're already essentially Christians with some minor problems. Maybe their sports team isn't going to win the big game unless they come to
Yeah.
Jesus, or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. Or the runner they're coaching isn't going to win the big race unless they come to Jesus or
Yeah.
something.
And it's interesting because that checklist that you said they go through to say whether or not it's in the film, it's in the book, and whatever entertainment you're in. It's kind of like that's what makes stories real.
Yeah,
And I understand if you have an inclination to delve into drinking, you don't want to watch something where there's excess drinking. I understand that. But
yeah,
whenever I was feeding homeless people in downtown Atlanta regularly, we saw people drinking. We
yeah,
saw homeless people. They had some foul language. We had
yeah,
conversations about their life because that's real. And like
yeah.
you have to tackle the real issues.
Well, here's the problem. This really exemplified the problem. A lot of my movies were commissioned work. People hired me to write the scripts. And I have a reputation, and people still come to me and ask me to write movies for them. And there was a case where it was about drugs. There was a woman who came out of like serious drug abuse and I believe prostitution and other issues as well. She had a very horrible life in the world of drugs. And these people wanted to make a movie that reached out to drug addicts. And I said, well, the only way you're going to make a movie that reaches out to drug addicts is to meet them where they are now and show the life. I mean, you don't necessarily have to see needles going into the skin or people physically having sex, but I'm like, you're going to have to show that world before they're going to trust you to show them how to get out. You're going to have to show them that world. And I told the guys, the producers, I said, if you show that, the Christian audience is going to reject you. Because I was taught, and I still think it's completely true, that you can't show anything in a Christian film that a pastor wouldn't feel comfortable showing in his sanctuary. So, I mean, that's the level. So, no bad language, nothing, no sex, no serious. You have more leeway with violence. And that's one of the reasons people make so many films based on the Bible or end times movies, because their end times movies are like the only movies where you can
Right.
justify having violence in it. But what it came down to is like and they realized it too about this drug film. And the woman was kind of famous in Christian circles for a while. She appeared on all the talk shows talking about her experiences, and people would let her talk about it. But if you actually depicted it in
Wow.
a movie, you would be in trouble. Ultimately, they figured they couldn't make the movie. They wouldn't take the money from their investors unless they felt that the Christian audience provides a floor. As long as your movie costs under what the floor is,
Right. Right.
you can justify getting the money to do it. But if but they're going to say drug use. You're going to go on Dove Foundation. It's not going to be, because really, at that time, to appear in the Christian bookstores like Lifeway, which is now gone as a brick and mortar or family Christian, you had to pass Dove Foundation and to get their family approved thing. But a lot of the world problems in this world shouldn't be seen, aren't family approved. You shouldn't show, a film about someone trapped in the world of drug abuse, isn't appropriate for a 10-year-old to do it. And if you can show that world in a way where it's appropriate for a 10-year-old to see it, it's certainly not going to help someone who's.
I mean, like you brought up a real issue, and it's like some of the stuff is not family appropriate. But whenever I was living in the ghetto of Atlanta, hearing gunshots every night, that's not family appropriate.
Yeah,
There's needles discarded on the side of the street that people had used the night before. That's not family appropriate. But there's families living in that area with children.
yeah.
And so we won't show the film, but we're also not willing to reach out and fix the problem either. And I think like that needs to be addressed.
Well, I wrote a blog called the Building the Faith-Based Ghetto, where I examined this problem of the faith-based films. It's the most popular blog I ever wrote. If you at the bottom of my list of blogs, I have the 10 most popular of currently, and it's always at the top. Rare is it
Mm.
ever beaten because some people link to it that keep getting hit. But it really shows that you know if you're aiming, if you're either entertaining Christians, or your evangelism. Here's my philosophy. You can do, if you're a Christian in film business, there's three ways. One, you can do films that are aimed at evangelism, at which point you should really reach to the people Jesus went out on the streets and found the people. He didn't wait
Right.
for them to come to the synagogue. You know what I mean? He taught in the synagogue too, but he went out onto the
Right.
streets. And that's what your film should do. If your goal is to evangelize, you shouldn't care about the Christian market. You should care about the audience you're aiming for. But the 99% of the Christian films are Christian entertainment. And to me, if you're going to, but all those films, if you look at practically every Christian film you've seen that's been made by an independent company, is about someone either coming to knowledge of the Lord or someone who has lost their faith returning to knowledge of the Lord. But that storyline in theory is aimed at the non-believer. To me, if you're going to make films strictly for the Christian audience, you should be making films about problems in the church. You
Mm.
know, like like why is Sunday morning the most segregated time in America?
Gosh.
Things like that. Why
Gosh.
do people go to judgment instead of when grace is demanded? Issues like that. You know, great
Yeah.
art throws a mirror up to the viewer. But what we're doing with Christian films is we're throwing the mirror up to the world and saying we're like that Pharisee who goes, "Oh, I'm so glad I'm not like those sinners who do
Right.
this, and this." Because we are not throwing a mirror up to the church. We are throwing a mirror up to the world. And the world isn't watching our movies. So if we're trying to do good with the movies, let's throw the mirror up to the church and look at ways to make us better. And I'm not perfect. I have plenty of sins. Look, you can tell by my neck, gluttony is one of them. But so that's what you should do. And the third way of doing it is to be what I call mainstreaming, which I would call Chapel Street. It's a book that's a mainstream book aimed at a mainstream audience, but it shows my worldview.
Hmm.
And even before I started making Christian films, back when they called me Mr. Murphy in Hollywood, when I had like a real agent, a great agent, and I was being read by A-list people. A lot of my scripts, some of them were extremely Christian, but nobody ever objected to them
Hmm.
because the Christian themes were a natural outgrowth of a story that they found compelling.
Right.
They were themes, there were films like I wouldn't have to worry about them cutting the Christian content out of it because, you cut the Christian theme out of it, it would be to the detriment of the story so much that they would never, no one, some of these films were more Christian than my Christian films, but no one ever said, hey, if you cut this out, this would sell. No one ever
Right.
said that.
I mean, like, and that just shows like the story itself is the most important part. I mean, like, can you imagine cutting out Aragorn's redemption arc out of Lord of the Rings? Like, no
Yeah,
one would do that. So, yeah.
exactly. So, as long as something works in the film, And it's, I wouldn't say that my secular films that have Christian themes they're not preachy. I will say that all of these films here, all of them, the Christian ones, are preachy, you know. And if I didn't make them preachy, they became preachier, after
Mm,
I handed in the script.
gotcha.
At one point, one of the producers literally went through find and replace for the word Jesus and replaced it with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ,
Whoa.
you know. And it was hilarious because then there was an atheist character, the central character was an atheist. So whenever he would say Jesus, it would always say our Lord and
Oh
Savior
my
Jesus
gosh.
Christ. So that script unfortunately didn't get produced, but literally find and replace and did that. And there would be things that Tim and I would write where the salvation message would be like one paragraph long, but when you see the movie, suddenly it's like 15 paragraphs.
Mm, right.
you know, because
Right.
it's sort of like you have to walk through the entire. Everybody who's saved, you can't be saved unless you walk through the entire sinner's prayer, like it's some sort of magical incantation.
Right.
And the funny thing about, I'm not putting down the sinner's prayer that they use often, but it's sort of like, you're saying terms that the people don't necessarily understand.
Yeah.
You know, people have got to keep into account that, and this is, I think, the problem with the American church that we're so intellectual is that this is really a supernatural religion. It's not an intellect. It is an intellectual religion. I can certainly make intellectual arguments for the existence of God, the reliability of scriptures, and all. But ultimately, it's not. It's a relationship with an unseen being.
Right.
You know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, guys, Chapel Street, before we move on to other topics, Chapel Street, July 3rd. You can pre order it now. The Promise is out now, but Chapel Street, July 3rd. Or if you're watching this in the future, you can buy it now.
Yeah.
And you can just
If you're watching it right now for like the next 2 weeks, there's still a sale on the Kindle version of The Promise for 99 cents. The publisher asked, does anyone want to? It was National Reading Month, and the publisher asked us if any of us wanted to lower the price to 99 cents for the Kindles. And I said, yeah, sure. I would
Yeah.
love to. I would love to do it. And I've been suddenly getting more reviews and people are reading it. So I'm happy that it's cheaper because, I'm not going to say I don't need the money, but I would prefer to have people read the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well,
Here's the thing, about releasing a book, because The Promise is essentially my testimony. And when it got published, I was so delighted. But when it came time to sell it to people, it's sort of like I felt a little uneasy because it's like I'm selling my testimony, which is something that should be given for free.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It just takes me a very long time to explain the circumstances of my salvation
Right.
and where it happened. So, unlike Chapel Street, that it is fiction, and I think Chapel Street, has lessons for the Christian audience. But I think it's a book I don't feel guilty
Right.
about selling, because although I believe it has value, it's not me trying to sell something that I'm supposed to be giving for free.
Yeah, that's like you said, it's a paranormal thriller. It's not going under the Christian heading. It's a paranormal thriller. So people can read it as that. Yeah.
Yeah, and suddenly it disappeared from behind me. I thought I had a screensaver
It's all right.
there.
I could throw it up on the screen all day.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessary. But
uh,
I really, I know this sounds a stupid thing to say. I really like Chapel Street. I think it's a really good book. you know.
yeah.
So
So let's talk about some of your other hobbies. If I understand correctly, you are into documenting graves for findagrave.com. I know you mentioned the website earlier, but why don't you kind of tell everyone what that is and how you got into it?
well, find a grave. I'm very into genealogy. My family tree I've got traced back quite a bit on most lines. And as a result, I've talked to hundreds of cousins from, all around the world, actually, Europe and America, so that's not all around the world, but most of my cousins are European, you know. So I mean, I did a lot of research, and one website I kept coming across periodically was a website called findagrave.com. And their goal is to document every grave where everybody in the world is buried. And I would discover it because occasionally one of my cousins would be listed on it.
Okay.
And what I decided to do was, to put my own family up there. And I knew where all of my grandparents, great grandparents, and all those were buried. So I started putting memorials up, but not just, they love to get photographs of the grave. And so I went out, I would photograph the graves or tombstones, but then I would add pictures of them with their families and all. And I would put biographical information about them. And then the website allows you to link people together. So my great grandmother will be listed, you can immediately click on her husband or their children or their parents. So if you find me on Find a Grave and you find my father, Douglas Ernest Murphy, you will probably you can essentially click through my entire family, see their biographies, see their pictures, learn the stories of their lives. And it really, and it's really important to me because, you think about it, they all lived these lives. They were just like us. Everything they lived was so important to them.
Right.
And now they're gone. And most of my relatives have like zero internet presence. You could type in the internet and they would never come up on anything. And I'm like, these people lived, to me at least, important lives. So, I wanted to give them, you know, a cyber memorial so that if anyone types in their names, something's going to come up and they're going to be able to see them. They'll be able to know what they did when they lived and what they did for a living and details about their lives, what their families were like, And when I ran out of my own family, which took a while because I had a lot of family, um, I started just documenting other graves. There's a cemetery near me, Emmanuel Lutheran Cemetery, that was essentially virgin. I don't think it was even listed on Find a Grave. So I listed it and I walked through that cemetery. I'm sorry about that. And I photographed every visible tombstone in it. And then I put the pictures of the tombstone, listed their names. And if something interested me about the people on the tombstones, or if I found the names interesting, I would go on the genealogical sites and find out details about them and put it in the memorials, and if I could find pictures of them, all the better. So that's what I started to do. And I've done that thousands and thousands of times, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 times, you know.
That's a lot, obviously. So I'm assuming during this course of time that you've visited quite a few cemeteries. Uh,
Yeah.
are there any that stand out as better than others?
Well, the worst cemetery I've been to in Baltimore was one called Mount Auburn Cemetery. It's an African American cemetery. At the time, at one time, it was the only place where African Americans could be buried,
Whoa.
and it was a mess. In some places, the weeds were higher than taller than me, and
Wow.
you'd go there, you would literally, most of the tombs, a lot of them were toppled. There was erosion going on. It was not uncommon to find human remains above ground in that cemetery. And
Wow.
I started posting, doing some postings on Find the Graves. And I was approached by an activist named Lou Mormon. She asked me whether I'd be willing to make a film to document the conditions there because she was trying to take over the cemetery in order to restore it. And I said, yes, I would do it. And I brought a friend of mine in, David Butler. And as we were shooting it, we were just going to make a little film. It was supposed to be about 10 minutes long as a presentation for the Maryland Coalition, the Coalition of Maryland Burial Sites, a little organization. But David and I were like looking at the cemetery and we thought it would be a nice feature length film. So we decided to do a feature length documentary about the cemetery, its history, and its current travails, and the struggle of activists to restore the cemetery, even though working against the current owners of the cemetery, this church that was looking, in my opinion, just ways to profit off of it without, doing any work in it. And it was an award-winning documentary. It went to many festivals, but in order to do that, we had to like separate from the activist Lou Mormon, and said, look, we were making a film for you, and we did make a film for her, but this documentary had to be independent so that we could examine both sides of the issue. And we got interviews with the pastors of the church, the cemetery directors, and state and local officials and experts in the field. And I believe the film is currently playing now. I don't have any times, but we signed a contract so it would play on the new Black News channel, the BNC. So it's currently playing. But it was, it had won some awards and played around the country.
Wow.
So we were glad. So that was a example of my obsession with cemeteries, my obsession with Find a Grave. We were just there yesterday meeting with some
Really?
activists. Yeah. So I can't put it away. And I saw some tombstones there that I had never seen before because there was, they had a recent cleaning in some areas, and I hadn't had a chance to see if those tombstones were on Find a Grave yet. But if they're not, they will be by tomorrow.
So, so what's it like for you when you walk through cemeteries now? Because I visited one 2 years ago to visit my grandmother's grave for the first time, and it had just rained, so all of the graves were soft and squishy, and there's no path to her. There's like not like a stone path to her grave. I had to walk across other people's graves, and I found myself apologizing to everyone that I stepped across because I'm like, I don't know what am I supposed to do when my foot is like sinking into someone else's grave. I was just like, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Well, let me tell you a story about my wife and myself. Here's how morbid I am. On like literally one of our first deaths, I was one of my cousins died in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I told her I was going to Scranton for a funeral and invited her. How many dates in was that, Debbie? It was just a couple. And I told one of my cousins I was.
I'm a funeral junkie too.
My
Okay.
wife is a funeral junkie now
Okay.
as well. So we were going up to the cemetery, and we were walking. And I was holding her hand, and we were walking, and I was trying to find my cousin's grave because we got there too late for the funeral service or something. And we were walking, and there was snow on the ground, and my wife started to sink. She put her foot down, and there was no there. Snow had covered it. And I had said it too, and I like lifted her up as I stepped back, and it turned out that was my cousin's grave.
No.
Yeah.
No.
So that was a creepy moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I literally pulled her out of the grave. Yeah.
You were going in.
And she pulled me out of the grave too. So it was an interesting thing.
Yeah.
I've gone to Scranton to do a cleanup of a Petersburg cemetery where a number of my relatives who had come over from Germany were buried. That cemetery was a mess too, but at least I never saw human remains in it.
Yeah.
So,
Have you how many cemeteries have you helped clean up?
not that many because just I was in Mount Auburn in that cemetery, but I've been to a lot of them, and I will sometimes document bad conditions at them. Fortunately, most some of my favorite cemeteries are well maintained. In Chapel Street, there are people visiting a number of cemeteries, and a lot of them are actual cemeteries, and I give the real names. But the cemetery where a lot of the climactic action happens is based on a real cemetery where my brother and sister and my father are buried, and a number of my other relatives. But I had to change the name on that because a lot of things happen in those scenes with that a cemetery probably wouldn't want people think happening in their own cemetery. So I had to change the name of that one.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I know I've briefly visited Find a Grave, and I know like you can click on someone's grave and it has the picture, but then it also has a short like kind of bio about their life, who they were, things they did, and I think it's really cool that you are helping kind of create memorials for that. Is there like a community of other people doing this where you guys frequently talk, or is it kind of just like you do your own thing?
It's pretty much we do our own
Okay.
thing. In the book,
We always do.
but we always communicate. I mean, that's how I ended up with doing the Mount Auburn thing. Someone saw my post and reached out to me.
Okay.
People reach out to me on in Find a Grave. You can communicate, and a lot of times I'll find people's graves, and their relatives will communicate that they're happy that I found them. And then sometimes they're new to Find a Grave themselves, and when you create a memorial, it's quote unquote your memorial to do with what you please. Add stuff, subtract stuff. And a lot of times, people will say, "That's my grandmother's grave. Will you transfer that grave to me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, certainly. I'm always happy to do it." I had kind of a telling one that was kind of tough for me. That about a week ago, somebody wanted a grave of one of my great granduncles. He was married to my blood aunt, my great grand aunt, but this was his side of the family. I had put him on Find a Grave because he was married to my aunt, and his family wanted him. And I'm like, yeah, okay.
That's tough.
He's in my family too, but I'm gonna let him have it.
Yeah.
You know, if they are members of my family, I will say in there, I will say what the relationship is. Like, this person is my fourth cousin, twice removed, or something, or my great grandfather. So usually, if they're related to me, I will make a note of that. Usually, people won't ask me for my relatives.
Yeah.
But in the book, the lead character Rick, who's the volunteer, is very much unnerved by another volunteer for it's Find a Grave, but I call it Resting Place. That he's the biggest volunteer in the area. He looks at other people who are contributing graves, and he's the biggest in the area. And he notices that this woman who goes by the name of Find a Grave is Tombstone Terry is approaching his numbers, and he's kind of unnerved by it.
Mm.
But she ends up having a link to him that he doesn't realize, and that she doesn't realize, and they end up battling this situation together.
Yeah.
So that's the love story.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely sounds interesting, and my first thought was it's strange that people are out there documenting graves. But the more I think about it, the more I'm like, it makes sense that every grave should be documented. It makes sense that these people should not just be forgotten in history. It makes sense there should be something out there with modern technology, the modern internet, where these people their information is stored.
Yeah. Well, people look at it. So many people who think about mortality and immortality, those that don't, like particularly those who don't subscribe to a belief in an afterlife, look at it that their family is their immortality, and that's their legacy.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is, most people, they're going to be forgotten by their families too. Everybody knows, unless you're adopted, everyone knows the names of their parents. And pretty much pretty much most people have met their parents and have memories of them. And most people know all four of their grandparents and have memories of their grandparents. But then, then it gets a little crazier at the great grandparent stage. Like I only personally met two of my great grandparents. But because of my genealogical history, I know all of their names and I have pictures of all of them. And I know what they did for a living. I know I talked to all their children. I know about, not only do I know what they did for a living, the abstract things. The concrete things. I know about their personalities because I've talked. To me, genealogy is more than just a matter of putting down names and dates. I want to know the people's personalities.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I have ended up, when I was doing my main family tree, the main part of it, I called over 300 cousins.
Wow.
I would call people who had no idea who I was. I would call to them and say, "Is this Catherine Nichols?" And it'd usually be like some 75-year-old woman. Yes. I go, "Was your mother, Andrea Collins, whose father was Albert Collins, whose grandfather was Jacob Collins, who had married Sophia Farber?" And they're like, "Well, yeah." And I go, "Well, so Sophia Farber had a daughter named Margaret, who married Arch Robertson, who had a daughter that married Paul Murphy. And Paul Murphy had a son named Douglas Murphy, and he had a son named Sean Murphy. And I'm Sean Murphy. And, I'm your third cousin once removed." "Oh, really? I didn't know all of that." And I go, "Well, I'm doing the family tree. Would you mind answering questions?" And they would give me their entire, everything. There was one thing I had learned, though. If you look on genealogical forms and how to do them, you get the person, you get their name and date, their birth date, and not their death dates because you're talking to them, they're still alive.
Right.
And then you get their spouse's birth date and thing. And then on the form, the next thing you're supposed to ask is their date of marriage. But I always ask that last, because what I've discovered was you ask them the date they were married, and then you say, "Okay, what's your children?" They'll list their children's name. What was the date? Then you go down. What was the name of your first son's birthday? And if they had just given you the date of the marriage, a lot of them were not going to give you the birth dates of the kids.
Yeah.
I've had that problem a few times. So what I've always do is go, I get their birth dates of their spouse, and then I go, "So how many kids you have?" "I have 5 kids." "Well, what's your name of your child?" "Oh, it's Albert." I go, "Oh, well, what's his middle name? And when was he born?" They'll give you this date. They give them all. And then at the end you go, "Oh, by the way, I didn't get it. What was your marriage? When did you get married?" And then they get that thing. So that's my free advice to genealogists.
Yeah.
You know what? I will say I called 300 people. Only 2 people in those didn't cooperate with me.
Really? So
Oh,
298. That's pretty good.
yeah, but I think I'd have a harder time now because people are more wary about
Sure.
identity theft. But the thing is, I give them so much information. If I was an identity thief, I might be able to tell them the name of their parents. But no identity thief is going to give them the name of their great grandparents or their great great grandparents, as I
Right.
often.
And then you're going over cousins,
Yeah,
marriages
things
between
like
different trees. Yeah, you're giving so much. I kind of want to shift here a
they're so
little.
grateful. These people were so grateful. As I
Yeah.
always say, talking to me gives them a chance to tell the stories that their kids have grown tired of hearing. Because
Yeah.
they're new for me and they're exciting. People have got to be cautious what they tell me about their
Yeah. I
family
mean,
because it's all been documented.
yeah, I remember when my mom was doing the genealogy stuff, and she found out all kinds of stuff about our family, the people way out there that we'd never heard of. I think there was one. I don't remember how he was related to us, but his name was Wilbur, and he worked on the train station, and he worked on replacing the tiles. And then they were supposed to change the train one time while he was out there, but instead, like, it got changed back, so the train came and hit him, and that's it.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's how he died. But he had a lantern because, like, I think in that area you got a lantern and then like a lunchbox. That's like what you got. And he had a lantern, and then through research, my mom ends up finding out that my grandmother like has the lantern, and so in her house is the lantern of like Wilbur's lantern. That's part of our family, and it dates way back, and like it's on display, and I've seen it. It's really cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. My wife, her great grandfather was a noted harpist in the Youngstown area. He had come from Wales, and they still have one of the harps. And
Oh, that's
I have
cool.
one of my second great grandfather, a violin made by my second great grandfather, but it's broken. I just need to give it to somebody who can fix it.
Well,
But I'd
that's
love to have his violin.
yeah,
I'd
that's
love
amazing.
I'd love for one of my granddaughters to learn to play the violin on his violin.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely amazing. I do want to shift real quick. A lot of the while we have tons of viewers from all over the world, all over different walks of life, a lot of our viewers are authors, and I was wondering if we could talk a few writing tips from you. Um, when you write screenplays, because the authors out here, they're writers, screenplays, and books. When you're outlining, do you outline your books and your screenplays, or do you free write it and then trim it down after a draft? What's kind of your process there?
Oh, I have two processes depending on whether I'm working on a commissioned screenplay or a spec screenplay. If it's commissioned, I have to give them something.
Okay.
Usually, I will be given, not very many details, and particularly on the faith-based films. Like I mentioned, Sarah's Choice earlier, the one I did with Rebecca St. James. Um, a investor saw an abortion activist on CNN doing an interview on CNN and thought the abortion activist was saying all these outrageous things. So he called PureFlix and said, "I want to make a film about abortion." And he had like a plot line that was going to be like two newscasters who do a point counterpoint, like from 60 Minutes, the old
Sure.
days.
Yeah.
You can't do that ever since that Saturday Night Live thing where they used to make fun of that. You can't do that anymore. And so they sent us that's like literally a paragraph. They're saying we want to do a film like this, and we looked at it and we said, this idea doesn't work. And so essentially, I have to give them. A lot of times my partner would let me handle like the treatments and things like that. And I wrote out like a little treatment, probably 2 pages long. And these treatments do not deal with the script fully. Usually, of like 2 pages, a page and a half will be the first act, the first 30 minutes of it, because that's where you establish the characters and the
Right.
conflict. And then on the middle act, it's sort of like things happen, and then I describe how it's going to end. So when I write for a movie and they ask me for a treatment, it's usually only about 2 pages. Now, no one's ever hired me to write a novel, once almost. So on that, or when I write a spec script, what I just need to know is how it's going to end. I usually, to me now, characters come first.
Mm-hmm.
Once, sort of a story, but, it's not a story until there's characters, because it's any story, no matter what the plot is, it's always about the people. And usually you can tell a good movie from a bad one is that, you know, it may have a great plot, but if it's not going to engage you unless the characters are there.
Yeah.
So once the character's full blooded, I need to know how the story is going to end, and then I'll start writing as soon as I know how it opens.
Okay.
As soon as I get a compelling open, there's a script I want to write now, just I can't figure out a good open for it. Once it opens there, I'll be able to write it. But I'm too busy now trying to dealing with book issues. And I had another book I'm like 8 chapters into, and since I've been writing about 21 St. Helens Street, I've been putting so much energy into researching the blogs that the book is like set aside. So,
Right.
but the blogs are rewarding. No one's paying for them, but it's rewarding in another way.
So,
And yes, next question. Sorry.
yeah, sorry. I was going to ask if you could explain what a spec script is, because the first one you said someone comes to you with the idea and you have to kind of flesh it out or change it, make it work. What's a spec script?
Spec is speculative. On a commission script, you're going to get paid no matter what. Someone's coming to you to say, "Well, if you write this script, we will give you this much money."
Okay.
On a speculative script, it's an idea. It's something you love it. It's an idea that you feel very strongly about, and you want to write it. Whether you get paid or not.
So that one would be more you write it and then you try and sell it.
Yeah, you try to sell it.
Got it.
Like right now, in theory, my next movie is one called I, John. It's based on a spec script that I wrote. And, it's out to actors now. The COVID, I think, is like thrown everything into disorder. But they're thinking of shooting it in the fall if they get the cast they want. So that will be very exciting. It's a script, it's a story I chose to tell on my own. Of course, everything changes. Everything changes on every screenplay you write. Producers change it, directors change it, actors change it,
Sure.
cinematographers change it. Our budget changes it, and when it's a commission script, you don't care as much about the changes because it's like they hired me to write the story. It's their story. If they want to change it, my name's going to end up on it, and certain parts of it are going to suck. But what can you do? It's their story.
Yeah.
When it's your story, it's a little more emotionally involving when they change, if they want to make changes that you really disagree with or hate. So,
so your process in both the spec script and then I guess writing your books is you flesh out your characters, make sure they're engaging, appealing to people, interesting. You figure out the end of the story. Mentally, you work backwards until you have a beginning that's interesting. Then you start.
yeah, generally, I have an idea of what it is going to be about, and then I think of who is somebody that would find themselves into this situation. Like obviously, on Chapel Street, it was inspired by something my mother had said. Do you think this entity in this house was partially responsible for the death of my siblings? So obviously, the character was going to be someone who was dealing with suicide in his family and a demonic entity. So it's sort of like, how does that work? Well, I don't necessarily want to write a book that ended like how we ended it, with like, we just got the hell out of there.
Right.
I wanted it to be a victory, so I knew he would have to ultimately, prosper or not end up dying at the end. So, it was just a matter of, who would this person meet along this journey and how would it come out? And in a sense, I found the first scene, I found a hook to get me into it while shooting cemeteries for Find a Grave. I was at a mausoleum, and you'll see him, if you read my thing in I think it's chapter 1, chapter 2, he goes to a cemetery to fulfill a photo request. On Find a Grave, some people are trying to find their relatives' graves, or they want a photo of it. You can post a photo request, and I fulfilled some of those. And in this, he goes to to fulfill a photo request and takes a photograph of this woman, Elizabeth Acoustic, who's a stranger to him, but he soon discovers her. This person was a fortune teller who his mother went to, and was also, back generations. The two families were intertwined, and he just never knew it. And for me in real life, I went to a cemetery, and it wasn't to fulfill a photo request, but it was also in a mausoleum. that had a photo of the person, and I took a picture of the grave itself, where the mausoleum where you put the
Hmm.
coffin, and the plaque, the bronze plaque, and there was a photo. And something I got a close up of the photo because I love to put pictures of people, gives you more of a chance to figure out who they are. And there was just something really creepy and haunting about this photograph that really like haunted me. And I like, so to me that was the hook. And
Sure,
also I
yeah.
think when I look at horror movies, um, the things of death are very compelling to people because we as a culture avoid the things of death. We don't want to be reminded
Right,
of that we're
right.
going to die. So, I knew I was going to put the things of death in this film. This was going to be about cemeteries and coffins and funerals and the things of death. And that's what it was about. But finding that grave, and I know the woman's name, I'm not going to say it. It would be very unfair
Yes.
because I subsequently went back and found her less creepy. I think I had to take my wife out there to look at her, and I don't think my wife found her as creepy as I did. But when I first photographed her, there was something strange and unnerving about her. So that was the hook for the beginning of the book to me. I start telling the story earlier too. I think always it's sort of like in a James Bond movie where there's that action pre-title action sequence.
Right.
You know, um, and I do that on books too. And in this case, I had the time period in my book that the character goes through is really only about a week and a half.
Okay.
Everything happens to him happens in a week and a half. But I start the book with a prologue about him coming home to find his mother dead, and that had happened 2 years earlier. So I made it a prologue rather than chapter one because it was so far removed from the
Right.
rest, time wise, from the rest of the book. But that was just also to set up the threat and the show, and because his mother's death was also a suicide, to set up the suicide
Right.
theme
Right.
as well. So I knew the book was going to be about suicide. I knew it was about demonic entities, and since the character was much like me, he was going to have a lot of my same habits.
Yeah.
Photograph graves.
So then definitely easy to start it in there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think when you write a book, the difference between a book and a movie is movies flow over you. You, as the writer, you write a story. The director, directs it. The cinematographer shoots it. The sound records it. The actors play the characters. And when you're in a movie theater, the experience flows over you. It's not like that in a book. In a book, you are conspiring with the author, because you're imagining it. It's not being presented to you as a whole. And it takes, you watching a movie, it takes you 90 minutes to watch a movie, or
Hmm.
2 hours, or 2.5 hours. A book usually, at least for me, takes longer to read. And as a result, I think, I can write a story that I just find cute and write it as a movie, something that I find interesting. But to me, if I'm going to ask a reader to actually take the time it takes to read a book, to invent it with me, to engage them on a mental level, the subject has got to be really important to me. I really feel I have to sort of bleed on the page in
Hmm.
order to make it,
Yeah.
if I'm asking you or anybody else to read this book, you know, they're taking that effort, you're taking that effort. I want to make sure that this isn't something glib for me, that it's something that was important, it took a lot of effort for me to write it. So far, I've only written 2 books, and both of them were dealing with subjects that were very emotionally troubling to me, and I feel, I kind of feel, I'm hoping to be lighter. On the next book I was already writing, yes, it deals with suicide, and yes, it deals with cemeteries and death and mysteries, but I'm hoping that it will be at least lighter. By the way, one thing people say about my book, I was happy to see on like Amazon reviews. At least people, I do always have a sense of humor. I think in these books, and despite the darkness of some of the themes of the promise, a lot of people have been pointing out that that there's a sense of humor in the book and in the voice of it. So
Yeah. And of course that's good. I mean, you see that like in the early Marvel movies. I don't want to talk about the more recent ones where it seems like it's nothing but punchlines. But at
yeah,
least in the early ones, they have serious topics and themes happening, but they also make jokes along the way to make it easier to get through.
Well, one of the reasons I've written so many faith-based films was actually the film that's supposed to shoot now, I, John, was the first one I wrote that was directly aimed at the faith-based market. I sent it to a producer, and he he read it, and he didn't want to produce that because he's an actor producer, and he was quite frank. There was no role for him in that movie. He read it, but what he loved about it was that it had a sense of humor. And he's like, "You wouldn't believe all these scripts we get, and no one has a sense of humor, you know." So,
Yeah.
and he wanted to write something that had a sense of humor. Actually, wanted it to make it a comedy, and that's why I called my friend Tim. I've written comedy before, but I think straight comedy should be written with other people. I love the idea of bouncing stuff off of other people I find funny. So if I write a comedy, I prefer not to do it alone. So that's why I called him and managed to pull him into it as well, and then we ended up writing a lot of movies together. But it was mainly what made differentiated me from all the other writers that were sending in scripts was that in my script, which was also very serious, had a sense of humor, and that's one thing that my agent liked. When my agent Stu Robinson, who was when I first signed with him, he was with Robinson, Weintraub, and Gross, and later they merged into with Paradigm. What he said my skill was writing drama with comedy, and he said that's the most marketable skill in Hollywood. In order to write compelling characters, which also had a sense of humor, and he goes, "You can write that, you can do anything." I don't think Sadly, my agent died. He died a number of years ago before I made my first movie. And that's my only complaint about my agent is he died without taking my career into account.
Yeah.
You know, he should have been more concerned about he should have,
That's
whatever, he should have been like, "I can't die now. I got to get Sean's
That's
movie."
right. That's
You
right.
know, he was a great guy, and I credit the fact that I stayed in the business as long as I did to the encouragement he gave me. Stu Robinson, wherever you are, buddy. And here's another guy. I don't read him. He was actually in a lot of interviews and all back in the day, but people don't talk about him as much now. So I'm giving a shout out to him from to beyond the grave. Stu, thank you for believing in me. But he did say that was the skill, that he felt I possessed. And I sent him this one script that was an action script. And his only complaint about it was, he goes, "Sean, you spend too much time on the car chases." He's like, "Anybody can write car chases. You write characters." So I thought that was one of the biggest compliments.
Yeah, that's a great compliment.
So.
Yeah, that's a fantastic compliment.
I think nowadays it may be better if you write the car chases.
Yeah. Oh, maybe it just depends on what you're writing.
Yeah.
Well, Sean, it's been an absolute pleasure. We're about a minute or an hour 42, so I figure we can wrap it up here. But it's been
an hour and 42 minutes.
Hour and 42 minutes. It flew by, right?
Okay.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. I had a great time. Are there any closing statements you want to throw out there?
I hate to be utterly mercenary, but if you've watched it this far, you should probably read what you read.
Yeah.
and The Promise too. And I hope somebody who reads this gets something, who watches this gets something out of it. But
yeah,
I definitely enjoyed it. You were great talk.
Thank you.
I've done other interviews before, and but you took me in places no one else has gone.
Thanks.
So that's always really refreshing.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad I could. I'm glad. I'm glad. Thank you. Chapel Street, July 3rd, unless you're in the future, and then just get it. The Promise, also, you can get it now. Both books on Amazon?
Yes, both books are on Amazon.
All right. Well, Sean, thanks for being here. Thanks for being with us. I appreciate it. Everyone, thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.